A network diagram is a visual representation of project activities and their dependencies. The network diagram helps project managers and teams understand the flow of activities, identify critical paths, and estimate project duration accurately. It is created by using precedence diagramming methods that use arrows to represent dependencies. Arrows indicate the relationship and dependencies between activities. Each activity is assigned an estimated duration that represents the time required to complete that particular activity, and when added up, the time required to complete the project. Project managers can identify opportunities for schedule management by analyzing the relationship between activities. Each activity is assigned a unique identifier and is depicted as a node on the diagram. The total float or schedule flexibility is measured by the amount of time that a scheduled activity can be delayed or extended from its early start date without delaying the project finish date or violating a schedule constraint. Let's look at the figure in front of you on the screen and identify the terms mentioned. Early start, or commonly represented as ES, is the earliest date the activity can start. Duration. Duration is the time required to complete the activity. Early finish, commonly referred to as EF. Late start, commonly referred to as LS, is the latest date the activity can start. And late finish, commonly referred to as LF, is the latest date the activity can finish. Then we have the total float. Total float is the difference between the early start and the last start dates. It is calculated using one of the two formulas that we will discuss in coming lectures. The following steps are involved in creating a network diagram. First, identify activities and dependencies. The second step is determining a starting point. The third step is inserting activities on the future nodes of your diagram. The fourth step is connecting the activities with arrows that represent the type of logical relationships. The third and fourth steps can be done in parallel. The fifth step is adding details to each relationship, such as the type of dependency, start to start, finish to start, finish to finish, or start to finish. Whether it is required or discretionary, it will be applied at this stage. The final step is identifying and creating an endpoint of the diagram. Let's try and understand all this with an example. In exam, you may get a question that may ask you to make a network diagram of table given and on screen in front of you, and calculate various components like float values, CPM, or identify paths or critical path, etc. In exam, you may get the same question in different formats. Sometimes a table like the one in front of you would be mentioned, and sometimes PMI will be gracious enough to give you a drawn-out network diagram. It all depends how much calculation is required in that particular question, and since PMI knows you have a little over a minute to do a question, they will not expect you to be professionally capable of doing all the steps involved. So they will break the same topic into different but related questions. So, step 1 will be to identify activities and dependencies. We have activities A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J that are given in the table mentioned. Process starts from activity A. Activity B is dependent on activity A. Activity C is dependent on activity B. Activity D is again dependent on activity A. Activity E. Activity F is dependent on activity C. Activity G is dependent on activity D and activity E. Activity H is dependent on activity F. Activity I is depending on activity G, and activity J depends on activity H and activity I. The second step is to draw a starting point. The starting point is activity A. Look at this figure in front of you that gives the same ES, EF, LS, and LF and duration as we discussed earlier. Now this is a bit hard to understand because we have not covered all the terminology so far. But suffice to say, once you master them through these lectures, they will come to you by default. So first thing first, the duration of activity A is 5 days. This implies that when on day 0 the activity A starts, it will take exactly 5 days for activity A to be finished. Its early start is 0 because it is the starting 5 days, which is calculated by adding the duration value to the value of early start. Similarly, the late start value of activity A will be 0 and late finish will be 5 days, which is calculated by adding the value of duration to the value of late start. Float or slack in activity A is also 0. How we got 0 is calculated using two different formulas that we will be discussing in future lectures. So for now, just assume that the information is correct. Let's plot the identified activities into a network diagram. Activity A is the starting point, so we draw and mention the activity A in a box. Activity B is dependent on activity A, implying that the activity B can only start once activity A is finished. Let's plot this activity B next to A and join it with an arrow pointing towards activity B. The sooner activity B can start is on or after the 5th day. Activity C can only start once activity B is completed. We will mention this activity next to activity C. Activity D is up next, and mentioned in the table we see it is dependent on activity A. So we draw a second arrow pointing towards the activity D and plot that as well. Then we have activity E, which we see is dependent on activity C. Same as in case of activity F. We draw two arrows pointing towards both these activities from activity C and plot them. Activity G is dependent on two activities to finish first. These activities are activity D and activity E. We will draw one arrow each from the successor activity D and E and point the arrows towards activity G. Next we see activity H dependent on activity F to finish first. We will plot it by drawing an arrow pointing towards activity H from activity F. Activity I has a predecessor activity G to finish first before it can begin. So we will draw an arrow pointing towards activity I from activity G. Lastly, we see activity J depending on activity H and I to finish first. It is dependent on these two activities, so to speak. We will draw one arrow each from activities H and I and point the arrows leading towards activity J. If you note between activities and the general direction of the project is always from left to right, and this is denoted by arrowheads. This web of lines between identified activities in PM lingo is referred to as network diagram. And for every exercise, the first step is to understand the activities, their dependencies, and then plotting them in their respective order to develop a network diagram. These arrowheads will help determine paths that the project will follow from initiation at point A to completion at point J. And while drawing this network diagram, we will ensure that the paths depicted by the arrows are not overcrossing any other arrows. Now it's prudent for me to mention here that in real life you will come across some paths crossing each other. as not only you will be plotting thousands of activities or tasks into a network diagram, but also there is a reason why those paths will be crossing each other. These crossovers are referred to as depicting risks in your network diagram. Many a times, the nature of tasks and activities is such that you perceive risk associated with them. These risks are these that you follow when making the network diagrams. Based on unique circumstances, you will observe that the paths are crossing or overlapping each other. Thankfully, this is too technical a topic to be discussed and not covered as of yet by PMBOK. Extensive risk-based calculations and computer simulations are involved that eventually reduce the crossovers of activity paths, and no such question will come to you in the exam that will require you to face such scenarios. But at the same time, beware that when you are drawing a network diagram on your rough sheets to determine a critical path value or any associated values of your network diagram, if your identified paths cross each other, you should know you have made a mistake somewhere. A bright student like you will be able to make sense of where I'm next headed. By merely looking at the network diagram and the flow of the arrowheads, you will be able to determine different routes from start to completion. In project management lingo, we call these different routes as paths. We will be identifying paths to this network diagram in the next lecture.